What is up, everyone? Crunchy Frog here, and today I'm going to give you my in-depth review of the 9th generation of Pokemon games, Pokemon Scarlet and Pokemon Violet. Now, these games released for the Nintendo Switch on November 18th, 2022, and as of the recording this video, I currently have just a little over 80 hours and counting of gameplay logged. So typically you'll see reviews posted, a few days after launch, with reviewers putting in about a dozen or so hours into a game, just enough to get a good enough feel of it to publish and talk about an honest review. However, we do things slightly different around here. I play games until completion, and I have searched through every nook and cranny, and I wait till I explore all gameplay elements thoroughly before publishing my thoughts. This means that this video may be slightly longer than your typical review, as I want to explore everything about this game that left an impression on me, good, bad, or otherwise. I was away from my streaming and recording setup for the bulk of my playthrough, and as such, I simply have included some Terra raid battles and world exploration gameplay. It's just kind of a background gameplay, and it should remain mostly spoiler-free. No huge story beats included in the recordings or anything like that. For instances where I do discuss the story or spoiler territory, which is just a small chunk of this video, I will let you know ahead of time so that you can skip forward. I'll try to include a timestamp, stuff like that, just so if you still haven't played through it, you won't be spoiled. So today we will cover what I loved, what I disliked, and I'll rate several aspects of the game in order to give you, the viewer, a more complete sense of what the game is like. Keep in mind, some of this review is subjective and reflective of my personal thoughts or opinions, and by no means is it definitive, this game is good or this game is bad, final report of the game. The game also may experience months or even years of fixes and additional content offerings after the publication of this video, so some things may be outdated or just simply no longer issues by the time that you sit down and watch this video. So with all of that out of the way, make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this review, as these long form reviews take a lot of effort and time, and make sure to subscribe for more gaming discussions, more in-depth reviews, and Let's Plays and live stream clips that I post weekly. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So to start off with all my reviews, I like to lead with the positive, right? So the good things that I enjoyed about the game. So first, I just want to talk about everything that I feel these games did right. So to start off with, there's way more quests and just stuff to do in this game in general. There's 3 entire quest lines, as was popularly advertised before the games came out, plus an end game and post-game content. Now, depending on your definition of post-game and end-game, it could be more or less than you would expect from a Pokemon game. However, I love that each quest line kind of provided you with meaningful progression in different areas of the games. For example, you receive TMs and resources to craft TMs from the Starbase path. You receive the movement mechanics for your Miraidon or Koraidon Pokemon through doing the Titan storyline, and you progressed your level of obeying and catching levels and everything like that through doing the gym storyline. So each 3 of the storylines gave you a meaningful quest or a meaningful reason to keep doing them. And all 3 kind of converge very nicely into a single story, and I guess that's where you would enter, quote-unquote, the post-game, when all 3 of the storylines converge and you go on kind of a little quest after you beat the Elite Four. And honestly, the fact that you don't even get into the huge legendary plotline very much until you've already beaten the Elite Four, which is after several hours of gameplay, is really cool, right? So it kind of gives you the impression that it's never quite over. You always have something to keep working towards, and there's always more content waiting on the horizon. And honestly, I feel like it was way better than a typical Pokemon offering, just because of those 3 entire quest lines. Obviously, I know games like Black 2 and White 2 have massive post and end games, so maybe this doesn't match up to them, but for me, I felt like it was a lot of content. You also have the classes and kind of relationship building quests with different characters at the university. Now, I haven't done the classes very much, to be completely transparent with you guys, but I do know that you get some pretty cool rewards, learn some pretty cool lore elements, as well as receive a special Pokemon, I won't reveal which one, for doing certain classes to completion. So that's pretty cool, and that Pokemon is actually not even in the regional deck, so it's just a cool little Easter egg of a Pokemon to get. Raids are also hopefully a great endgame challenge. Obviously, you get a lot of materials from them and stuff like that, kind of a reason to keep grinding them. But I also hope that, and we'll touch on this later, that this is a great way for them to implement more content going forward. They've already done a Charizard raid, which Charizard can't be obtained normally in the game. And they've already had a couple weekends where you can go in, and it's called a 7-star raid, which is the highest raid you can do. And you were able to obtain a Charizard. I haven't been able to just because I don't have any level 100s that are made for that battle just yet, but hopefully in the future they bring more events just like that. To kind of follow up with that, the story is just much better than before. And here's where I will institute the spoiler warning. So starting here, we will be discussing some light to heavy spoilers for the game, and I'll include a timestamp on screen whenever I'm kind of finished with that, so you could just skip ahead and skip all these spoilers entirely if you haven't played the game yet. Alright, so if you're sticking around with us, you've already played the game or just don't care about spoilers, we'll get right into it. So the arc with Arven and Mabosstiff, I'm still not sure how to pronounce it, Mabosstiff, either way, their arc was great, and honestly it felt much more impactful than the typical Pokemon story beats. It was much more emotional and kind of realistic. Touching on a Pokemon's death has happened a few times throughout the franchise, obviously the first games with the Marowak in the Pokemon Tower and stuff like that, but this time it just feels so much more fleshed out and realistic and emotional. Also touching on the fact that a Pokemon age, and they don't just die randomly, right? They age and get old and kind of decrepit, and their body breaks down, kind of like real animals or real humans do, was also, to my knowledge, a first, and it helped to flesh out the overall world of Pokemon a little bit more, and just made it seem that much more grounded, which obviously we're not playing Pokemon for realism or grounded storylines by any means, but it does help when they toss in little moments like that. Also, again with Arven, he seems to be a counterpoint for these wonderful story beats, but having his parents actually leave him, and one of them even eventually die, kind of felt a lot more weighty than something I expected to see in a Pokemon title. They obviously continuously touch throughout the game on how the abandonment actually affects Arven, and kind of how he wishes for his parent, whether it's the female professor in Scarlet or the male professor in Violet, how he kind of strives for their love and affection and approval and everything like that throughout the game, because they kind of just left him. And, it's usually something the Pokemon steers clear from. We've seen a lot of single-parent households that are just never quite explained or embellished upon in the Pokemon franchise, but this is one that they actually touch on. And, how would the kid feel if his parent was a professor and went off into a cave one time and just never came back, right? They try to tie it a little more to reality. And that kind of goes back to our last point about Mabosstiff kind of dying or getting old, right? It just lends itself a little bit more to realism, a little less plot holes than you would see from a typical Pokemon story. The plot also tries to delve into more complex matters. Again, this is a recurring theme here, but it's not just defeat the bad guys and save the good guys like a lot of past Pokemon games have been. Themes like bullying and not fitting in are explored thoroughly, which are much more pertinent and useful to the 10 to 15-year-old demographic that Pokemon typically targets, right? Those are the kids that are going to be in elementary school or middle school or early high school that maybe don't blend in like the Team Star kids do, and maybe they get bullied as well. So just stuff that the target demographic can relate to a little bit more. Obviously, I've aged a little past that, so some of the stories still felt kind of childlike to me, but I can picture a 12-year-old picking up this series for the first time playing through this game and relating to a lot more of the story than maybe typical Pokemon games offer, where you just take down some criminal mastermind that was trying to blow up the earth or something. Even the evil team this time ends up not being so black and white in terms of evil versus good, and they're not necessarily the good guys. They still did some horrible things. They still, skipped out on school, stuff like that. But overall, we could see that they're more so just misunderstood and that they had good intentions all along. And that's a huge step away and kind of a more realistic step than previous games where, again, it was just some evil masterminds in crazy suits that were, trying to activate some kind of crazy laser underneath a town or something to blow the world up. So a much more grounded and complex storyline throughout throughout, and there's no more overuse, like the whole world is going to end all of a sudden because of the evil team's plotline throughout. And typically that's something you see in Pokemon games as well, is that the world is constantly on the edge of danger, and it kind of desensitizes you to really anything. Not that anyone plays Pokemon for a gripping storyline, but you get what I mean. There is some stakes at the end of the story with, the possibility of the time machine kind of opening up much more futuristic or ancient Pokemon, depending on the game you're playing, and that kind of ruining the ecosystem. They talk about that. But it doesn't feel as core to the story as, some of the other story beats do. And it definitely seems a little more realistic in terms of the stakes that are had. So now that you're joining us, we have finished talking about any major plot lines and spoiler territory and anything like that. So if you had skipped ahead, welcome back. So the next thing that I really enjoyed was the character models. So both human and Pokemon character models seem to have a massive upgrade in this generation. And one of the things I could see that they tweaked in the game engine is textures and material differences. So different shaders, different things like that. And texture packs that you could see are hard-coded into the game. So one of the first ones that stood out to me, I got a Lucario fairly early on in my playthrough. And all along, I've known that Lucario has some metal bits on him, but they've always just been like gray colored, right? But in this game, they're actually shiny metallic bits, right? He has the spikes on his fists, he has the little like armbands and stuff like that, and they're actually shiny and metallic looking. They're no longer just a default like gray texture. And the rest of him looks furry, as well as all the other furry Pokemon. So they have different textures for metallic substances, for furry substances. There seems to be several shaders. Another one that really stood out to me was Hippowdon's snout. It looked leathery and kind of realistic. If you've ever looked at an animal's nose area, kind of like that cracked leather look that they have. I don't know how better to describe it, but it looked a little more realistic. And we're seeing Pokemon slowly look more realistic, more relatable and stuff like that. And obviously, I don't want it to go too far into like the weird uncanny valley of, say, Detective Pikachu, but certain steps in the right direction here just to, increase the immersion in the games really helps. And hopefully this texture and shader engine can be improved in the future, and we just start seeing better and better 3D models of Pokemon as the generations go on, and hopefully this technology is just a stepping stone going forward. There's also been a lot of quality of life improvements. Now, I know some of this stuff is returning from the last few generations, but in the interest of transparency, I didn't play much of Generation 8 or Generation 7. So some of these I'm just stumbling upon now, but I am still going to comment on what this game does well in terms of creature comforts and quality of life stuff and everything like that, just because it did impact rather how much I enjoyed the game. So one of the first things, and I know this was at least in Gen 8, I don't know about Gen 7, but the PC boxes accessible from anywhere was a huge thing for me. I cannot stress this enough, especially while I was grinding for the completed Pokédex, which I'm so close to at the time of this recording. It just made everything so much easier. Whenever I finished a Pokemon or evolved it, to get the next Dex entry, I could just throw them in my box real quick while staying in the training area that I was in and grab another Pokemon and be on my way. It's something that really sucked from the first, few generations of Pokemon, having to fly back to a Pokemon Center and having that fixed. Again, I know it was like that last generation too, but that's just a massive improvement, and I'm so glad that they brought it back. Next, and again, I know this hasn't really been a thing for the last few generations, but I just need to bring it up again because it's so great compared to what we saw in the first few generations, is there's no HMs needed. So there's no special moves in order to, go to certain areas of the map. That's all locked behind Miraidon and kind of his progression, or Coraidon, I guess, if you're playing Scarlet, in terms of, you beat Titans and he gets stronger so he can do more things. So the map is still gated off for you, but in a much less frustrating way. You don't have to have a HM slave type Pokemon, like Babero or something that just learns Cut cut, strength, waterfall, just to get you around the map. You have a special Pokemon in your back pocket, so to speak, a seventh Pokeball of sorts, that at any time you just hop on and, traverse the landscape in whichever way you want. And again, it's still tied to story exploration, so you can't just roam the entire world as soon as you start the game. But by and large, it just makes things so much easier, and I'm so glad that they have not brought those back. Next up is through various IV and EV training methods, there's no such thing as really crap Pokemon anymore, right? Every Pokemon can have potential. Now, there are arguments to be made for the contrary of that, of how maybe it makes certain Pokemon feel less special, if you get a perfect IV Pokemon, or, you EV trained very hard, against wild chances to raise your HP for, 35 hours in one of the past games, and now that's not as pertinent. But there's so many easy ways to get stuff like protein and carbos and stuff like that to raise their EVs, and you can use bottle caps to IV train them up to perfect IVs and stuff like that. So basically every Pokemon is usable. So that's really cool for me, because I know there's some Pokemon that you get in the beginning of the game and you're not really paying attention to their nature or their IVs or whatever. And you can eventually make them good. So maybe you started out with a really crappy Pokemon, but now you've bonded with that Pokemon, it's level 80. You really want to make sure it has good IVs, stuff like that. You can change some of that, such that, no Pokemon is a lost cause anymore. And I know for the competitive scene, that's massive. I don't competitive battle myself, so it doesn't really affect me more than just I want Pokemon with high stats to be cool. But I know for those guys, it's massive. And so that's a huge quality of life improvement, just making things a little bit easier. And obviously, go with that some breeding mechanics and stuff like that to pass egg moves and natures down and stuff like that I won't really get into in this video. But just know that, every Pokemon has a little more potential than they did before. And the transparency in terms of being able to see those values, like their individual values and effort values, are a lot more front and focused. And, anyone can see them all the way down to a 10-year-old just playing the games for the first time, or, a 25-year-old guy that has been doing competitive battles for years now. It's much more accessible. Next up with that, and kind of to tie in, is the shiny odds are vastly improved. Now, I don't know which generation exactly brought the shiny odds down from 1 in 8,000 something to 1 in 4,000 and something. But I know in this game, for example, it's like 1 in 4,096. However, there are so many ways to increase those odds down to, I think the lowest you can get them is like 1 out of 512. Every 512 is a shiny. And that's obviously in a wild encounter and a bunch of other stuff, sandwiches being used, different things like that. But just know you can whittle those odds down to literally 1 in 500, which is way above what shinies were in the past. And pair that with the fact that there's so many more Pokemon spawning at any given time than typical Pokemon games. And that just means the shinies are still super rare. They're still an accomplishment. They're still a cool little treasure to find, but they're finally obtainable, right? Growing up, I didn't know a single person that had found a shiny. I think my one friend said he accidentally killed a shiny Starly in Pokemon Diamond, but that was about it. None of us had one. None of us could share one. None of us could say we captured one. But now they're fairly common. I think I have 8 or 9 as of the recording of this video. Some from being shiny hunted, some from just finding them in the wild. But either way, they're finally obtainable. And shiny hunting, while still very mundane and kind of boring, at least feels approachable and possible for the everyman, right? You don't have to be a Pokemon enthusiast to learn how to shiny hunt and to be able to do so effectively. Like I said, I've specifically shiny hunted in the mass outbreaks. I think 3 or 4 shinies right now. So and that's even without the shiny charm and without getting into sandwich making and stuff like that, at which point your odds go way up. So it's very accessible. And again, it can be as simple as just finding one out in the wild because so many Pokemon spawn throughout your playthrough. Or, again, if you're a Pokemon enthusiast, you watch several YouTube videos on how to min-max certain stuff, you could go out and find 10, 20, 30 shiny Pokemon in a day. The next up in terms of quality of life improvements is the auto heal feature. So if you bring up your Pokemon menu and you hover over a Pokemon that is currently injured, you can actually press the minus key and it just kind of figure out how much health it needs and just auto heals. Unfortunately, it doesn't heal status conditions, which is kind of a pain. But at the very least, you could just press one button. You don't have to go into your bag and select a super potion and then a potion and then an orange berry just to heal somebody up. It'll just figure it out for you and try to use the lowest tiers first, so it's not just blowing all of your hyper potions just to heal 10 health on a Pokemon. So that's really cool. There's also an overabundance of both rare candies and just XP candies, so that really helps, especially if you don't really want to train a Pokemon. Maybe you need to level it up once to learn a move or to evolve or something. You can just toss some candies at it and get it over with it without grinding, for 10 or 15 minutes to level it up. And then obviously, at the higher levels, a rare candy goes a long way to get something from, say, 98 to 99 or 99 to 100. Some people don't really like this. They say it makes Pokemon too easy. But let's be honest, they could just not use them, right? If you don't like the idea of candies giving an instant level or an instant 10,000 XP, just don't use them. But for those of you that want that little bit of a boost, they are available in the game and they're farmable through the Terra Rays, which is awesome. There's also great rewards for the Pokedex progression. So in the past, you've kind of filled out your Pokedex, you finished your national dex or whatever, or your regional dex rather, and you've gotten like one single Pokemon from the professor or something like that, some kind of one singular reward. This game rewards you every 10 entries that you do. So there's 400 Pokemon in the game, and every 10 you get this, so there's a total of 40 rewards, and I believe at the end is actually when you get the shiny charm. I could be wrong on that, but essentially it rewards you the entire way, so that kind of helps you and incentivizes you to keep going on that Pokedex progression. And to tie in with that, this is actually the first mainline Pokemon game that I am trying to complete the regional dex. I did so in Legends of Arceus, but again, a great game as well. But that was kind of an offshoot, and that was meant for everyone to fill up the Pokedex, right? But this one is a mainline series, and because of all the quality of life improvements and those little rewards that you get along the way, I find myself actually going for 100%, and I've never done that before. So, if that tells you how fun it is to try to complete the dex. And speaking about the regional dex, obviously there is 400 Pokemon to collect, and they include some of my absolute favorites from the franchise thus far. Oddly enough, they really prioritize dragon types, it seems like, in this generation. I mean, they have like almost every single dragon type family that has been made in Pokemon thus far. I think maybe a couple have been left out, but by and large, there's just a lot of Pokemon to choose from. And I know that people were bummed that there isn't a national dex. I'm assuming that'll probably come in some form or fashion eventually down the line, sort of like Sword and Shield did. But for right now, they give us 400 off the bat, which is more than some generations had altogether in the beginning, and we still enjoyed those. And they're 400 great Pokemon as well. And to go along with that, a lot of the new Pokemon that were introduced are largely incredible. Some of them fall flat, and we'll talk about some of those later, but I know, like, the Artibax line, I think it evolves into Baxcalibur is the final one, and that's the pseudo-legendary dragon type. It kind of looks like Godzilla, to be honest. That's super cool. I really enjoyed getting one of those. Garganacl, which is like the Minecraft-looking salt Pokemon, is one of my favorites of all time now. I love, as most of you know, I'm a huge Minecraft guy, so seeing a Minecraft Pokemon, not that it was inspired by Minecraft probably or officially, but obviously it looks very blocky, looks very Minecraft-like, and he was one of my favorites, and I had him on my team since the very beginning. And then finally, Scarlett, which is the evolution of Charcadet, the one with the swords, is one of my favorite Pokemon of all time now, bar none. And that comes from both the stats and the moves it learns, but also just its design. So for me to find one of my top, honestly, top three, if not top one, like top of the top Pokemon of all time in my mind, Scarlett, for that to be introduced during this generation is amazing. Gimmighoul is also a cool little gimmick Pokemon, and I've really enjoyed, collecting all the coins and stuff like that to evolve him. And honestly, the fact that he turns into a little mozzarella stick guy, the Silver Surfer of sorts as well, at the end is just a super cool Pokemon. And there was a bunch of Pokemon that just had really cool evolution methods, that like the Tumbleweed Pokemon that you had to throw on the ground and run around with for him to walk 1,000 steps essentially before leveling up and evolving. Super cool evolution gimmicks like that. Again, I'll go into, down the line, maybe go through and rate all of the Pokemon from this generation. I won't bore you guys with that during this review, but just know there are a lot of great Pokemon introduced this generation. And again, they've brought a lot of great Pokemon back from the past as well to fill out the regional decks. They've also had, to kind of go with that, a lot of cool names for the Pokemon. They seem to have embraced kind of the meme culture behind some of the names, and I feel like they got really creative with the names like Smoliv and Lechonk. Just really cool. And name like Garganacl, which incorporates the NaCl for sodium chloride or table salt, is just super cool to have. And I think they actually were very creative this generation. Sometimes they slack, but they really knocked it out of the park on this one. The next biggest thing is seeing the Pokemon actually live and interact in the wild is great. Now, it's not perfect, and I will talk about some shortcomings in the cons section, but it's truly great to see all the animations that they made for these Pokemon. Persian laying down and other Pokemon interacting with each other or with nature. I know like the Jumpluff line and Hoppips and everything, they like blow away when there's a strong wind, and that really got me. I thought that was really cool. Somebody I'd seen on YouTube, I haven't seen it in game, I don't believe, but when it's raining Sandygast, the little sandcastle Pokemon kind of melts down, obviously, which happens to real, sandcastles in the rain or when they get wet. So that's super cool. Like little details like that in the animations. Obviously, they had to put a lot of work in knowing the Pokemon were going to be living in the world, and they don't do a fantastic job. It's not 100% organic, but it is a huge step forward from what we've seen in the past. And honestly, there's some really cool details. Again, we're not going to get into all of them now. Maybe I'll make another video in the future of little details like that, but just suffice to say, there's a lot of cool little details and animations, and seeing them in the wild is so great. It also helps to see like their different sizes. So Pokemon have different sizes in this game, much like they did in Legends of Arceus. And so you could see a group of a certain Pokemon, and you could see one that was significantly bigger than the rest and one was significantly smaller, and that can kind of make each Pokemon feel unique and special as well. Obviously, there's not a huge size difference. It's not like you're going to walk over and see like a Cetitan the size of a small village and then another Cetitan that's about the size of your foot. But there is enough of a size difference to make each one feel, like I said, unique and cool. And you can say that you caught the biggest, Pokemon that you've seen in the wild and stuff like that. And it just kind of makes it cool and gives you something to talk with your friends about. And it also makes the Pokemon feel much more real, instead of just randomly getting a cutscene whenever you're walking through random tall grass patches in the world, right? So instead of just hitting the RNG essentially and just rolling the dice and a random Pokemon popping out, you're actually seeing them. You can target them, you can run over to them, or they can run over to you, and it just all feels so much more lifelike. And I'm sure that's what they were going with the open world kind of feel for the game, and it just works so incredibly well. Again, it could be done better, and I hope it's iterated on in the future, but it's just such a step up from traditional Pokemon that I'm very happy. Next up is there's a lot of cool conversion evolutions, and this has been a trend, I want to say the last two-ish generations, and I hope it continues. It's kind of a step forward beyond the regional variants, wherein, it's technically a different species of Pokemon entirely, but you can tell it's very much so related to the other, a previous species of Pokemon. For example, the Toedscool line. So we have Toedscool and Toedscruel in this generation, which are essentially land-faring tentacruels. And it's super cool. Obviously, again, they're not the exact same Pokemon. They are different. It's not a, Paldean Tentacle by any means. It's physically a different species. But, being that they're convergent evolutions, they were once the same and branched off as they got into different ecosystems. And it's really cool to see. I love this a way to introduce quote-unquote new Pokemon while still bringing back some of our favorites. And I think that combined with regional variants, it just adds a nice way to pad out the decks without having to come up with entirely new designs. Or, next time we'll have a computer monitor Pokemon, I'm sure, in Generation 10. They're running out of ideas. But this is a cool way for them to still come up with new and exciting things without having to come up with absolutely brand new ideas or new Pokemon. Next up is, I'm not gonna lie, there's a pretty decent end game. Now, it's not the greatest ever, but I really do enjoy grinding out the Ace tournaments, which are essentially the replacement for the Elite Four rebattles. But in my mind, a lot more fun because you can essentially go through it and you're always versing different people. It's kind of randomized. You don't just go in knowing the exact same Pokemon. I know in Pokemon Emerald, man, I grinded through the Elite Four probably 100 or so times and it just got old, right? But that was the best way for XP. This is a great way for XP as well and kind of end game battling against pretty high level Pokemon. But there's a little more feel of randomness to it and a little more fun. You have to be a little more prepared this time around. And I'm also excited to start grinding the raids. I have done obviously a decent amount in order to get the gameplay for this and to get some materials and stuff. But I am excited to start grinding to get some level 100s for those and possibly farm new Pokemon if they are added, to the game like they did with Charizard and stuff like that. So really, the end game does incentivize level 100s a little more than previous games have done, and that to me is a great feature. There's also the great possibility for DLC. They've left a lot of threads kind of open and waiting, such that they have the possibility nowadays everything has DLC or post-launch content. So they've left out a lot of avenues for adding some great DLC. I'll probably make another video on this in the future, in terms of what DLC we could be seeing and stuff. But, hopefully Nintendo and the Pokemon Company don't kind of do what they normally do and just completely mess up or drop the ball in terms of DLC offering. Hopefully they do, give us some great stuff post-launch. I'm mainly excited, we've seen things for like a combination of the legendaries, we've seen in the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet books in the games, so that could hint to some DLC as well. Obviously, the biggest one that I'd love to see is more of the past and future Pokemon. So the Paradox Pokemon in these games are essentially ancient versions of today's Pokemon and future, far future versions of the Pokemon that are brought through via a time machine. I would love to see so many more of these. I know it might be hard to design many more of them, but I'd love to see a few dozen on each side, ancient and future, brought to the game, just because, again, it's kind of like the regional versions or convergent evolutions, kind of like remasters, so to speak, of fan favorite Pokemon, right? The fact that I got a completely robotic Hariyama in this one called Iron Hands, that's just like a robotic dude with massive floating hands. It's just super cool, right? And I'd love to see more ideas like that in future DLC. And to me, it just makes sense, right? That's the first spot they should go to when looking for post-launch content. There's also the possibility of a Kalos or Kalos DLC from Generation 6. Technically, in the real world, Kalos is based on France and Paldea is based on Spain, so it makes sense. They are touching in real life, and there is a region on the map that's kind of locked away and you can't access it, and it's kind of grayed out on the Paldean map that would be sort of where France is in real life. So again, that kind of hints to maybe a Kalos DLC. I would love to see that. Overall, there's just a million different great DLC items, and typically, Pokemon games are kind of self-sustained, and DLC is a new kind of feature and to the Pokemon series. But I'm hoping with all these threads that they've left, all these loose ends, that hopefully they time up with some great DLCs in the future. And obviously, the possibility for the national decks to come, or at least brand new Pokemon, coming to the game. That's just a whole lot more that you can grind for and fill out your decks and possibly do new raids for and everything like that. It seems like it is set up for a live service model, even if we haven't necessarily gotten a roadmap or anything just yet. So finally, guys, just overall, in terms of the last pro that I have, or, good thing about the game is it's just super fun. It's honestly the most fun I've had with a video game in quite some time. It was so fun that, honestly, the technical glitches and performance issues that we'll be talking about down below in the con section hardly even deterred me. It just so fun, and it sets such a great precedent for Pokemon to build off of and make better in future iterations. And, I'm hoping that they make more engaging and more awesome open worlds going forward. Hopefully this is just a stepping stone. This is their first try, to see what they could do in just Gen 10 or the next Gen 9 games or whatever might be on the slate going forward. I hope that they just build on that and make every game better going forward. And honestly, it truly feels like a turning point in the franchise. Again, we could talk about the technical glitches and whatever down below, and maybe they're not ready for this turning point in the franchise, but it truly does feel like that massive shift, much like when Assassin's Creed went to the more open RPG style with Origins. It kind of feels like that massive turning point to where all games in the future will feel massively different than the Pokemon games in the past. And again, I've already put over 80 plus hours into it, and I can honestly see me putting a lot more in the future. So, obviously, there might have been some that I missed, but that was a pretty good wrap up of all the things I enjoyed about the game. So, now we'll talk about some of the things that I maybe did not enjoy that much. So, to start off, there was a lot of seemingly useless single stage Pokemon. I know that every generation has a few, but there definitely seemed to be a bit more in this gen. Pokemon like Squawkabilly and Bombardier and Flamigo, just like really wasted potential. And I know for me personally, like evolutions in Pokemon are one of the things that I love most about the games. And so to have those kind of seemingly useless single stage Pokemon, especially ones that don't have super high stats, it just kind of feels wasted, right? At least give me a pre-evolution or a secondary evolution, just something, because it aids in the progression of the game and with a specific Pokemon. And honestly, I thought that some of the lines that were only a single stage evolution, meaning that they evolved once, could have used a two-stage evolution, so kind of like the starters, right? Two evolutions. I would have liked to see another evolution of Titan, for example. I thought that would be really cool. So I just think they didn't go far enough with some of them, and that kind of was unfortunate. Also, to go along with that, the final starters are very meh for me. I enjoyed Skeledirge. Obviously, I picked him as my starter. I picked Fuecoco, but I still don't love his design. And to be honest, I am super tired of the, all starters must have human jobs trope that they kind of started with Gen 6. And this time we have like a grass type jester magician type with Meowscarada, and then a literal salsa dancer with the water starter Quaxley and eventually Quackavall. I hate the fact that they're moving more and more towards all the starters are just humans with jobs, but like they have fur on them. I kind of just want them to go back to being super badass animals that can manipulate the certain elements. You know what I mean? So, and I feel like Skeledirge kind of moved in that direction. He didn't have a job, so to speak. He did sing or whatever, but it wasn't like he was a singer. He didn't look like a human. He was very much so a crocodile, poorly designed crocodile, but a crocodile that could manipulate fire and stuff like that. So, wasn't a huge fan of any of the final evolutions and starters. But that's kind of be expected after these last few generations. And next, I know it's a controversial opinion, but I'm not a huge fan of the bike forms for the legendaries. I just hate the idea of giant wheels sprouting from Pokemon and and turning into bicycles and planes and stuff on a whim. I do enjoy the full power, which is like the battle versions of them. I really enjoy those designs a lot. And I really love the quote unquote low power versions, which is when they're just kind of chilling, walking around. I do enjoy those two forms, but the intermediate forms where they're bikes and they have jet engines and they're flying around, I'm not a huge fan of them, to be completely honest. I love the gimmick of having a Pokemon that can get you around the open world. I just don't like the fact that it has wheels and looks kind of weird and you ride on it. But regardless, that's about all I have to say on that one. Next up, it is way too easy to just accidentally step on Pokemon. Now, I know this is a tiny issue, and it's still a massive improvement over previous gens where you couldn't avoid Pokemon unless you used a repel or something. But, honestly, being able to see the Pokemon and then trying to avoid them and still not seeing a tiny little Flabebe or something that gets in your way and kicks off a battle is honestly kind of more frustrating, right? You think you've avoided everything, and then boom, there's a tiny little Flapple on the ground that now you're stuck in a battle animation, and you've lost a couple minutes of travel time. So that's just kind of annoying. And honestly, I have gotten stuck in a few cases where there were chained battles. Basically, I got stuck in a battle. I tried to leave the battle, and there was a Pokemon just waiting for me and instantly caught me in a loop. The one time I actually had to reset my game because I was stuck in a tiny cave and there was like an outbreak in there or something, and it just kept queuing up battles. I would run from a Pokemon or defeat it or whatever, and immediately I'd be back in another one. I physically could not get away from battles. So I have seen that happen many, many times during my playthroughs, and it's just kind of annoying. I kind of hope. I just wish they would stay away from you a little more often in some cases. This also led to some desired Pokemon escaping, right? I would see the Pokemon that I want to catch, over there in the field, and I'd start biking over to them, and all of a sudden, whether they pop in because of the horrible graphics or because I couldn't see them because they were tiny or whatever reason, I accidentally step on a Pokemon. Sometimes that can make the other one disappear or despawn or whatever, and I lost the Pokemon I actually cared about just for some stupid little Starly that I didn't want to catch or battle. And also, some tiny Pokemon, just like I said, you can't see them until it's too late. And the horrible draw distance and spawn radius just heavily compounds on this. I've had a ton of Pokemon spawn like right at my feet and stuff like that as I'm biking, and it's just not great. Next up, the gym challenges were kind of okay, but they mostly just fell short. Honestly, I would rather just have the old challenges back where the gym was kind of set up like a physics puzzle, and you had to do different things to get to the gym leader. Some of these were really dumb. Like one of them, I ran around with Sunfloras, which I hate as a Pokemon, but that's a different story. And they all ran at like 2 frames a second behind me because there was too many entities to load into the game, and it was just not fun. And another one, you had to like kick an olive across this field. Like it was just, they were not great. And I kind of wish just to have the typical gym challenge. And this meant that the gyms really didn't have any style. There was battlefields set up throughout the cities that the gyms were in, but you didn't get the feel of like going into a grass type gym and being in a forest or something, or going into the water gym and having it set up like water slides or something cool and themed. It was just like the same building for every region and the same lobby for every city. And then you did some meaningless task in the city, and then you battled them at admittedly some cool arenas, but I much rather would have had the gyms themselves kind of themed like in past generations. And to go along with the gyms feeling bland, the cities all felt incredibly bland. You couldn't really go into hardly any buildings. I know that has been a huge thing that people have been complaining about. And even the school was chopped up into like individual rooms that you had to fast travel to. So you couldn't even explore like the university itself. You were just in front of it, you walked through the building, and then everything else inside of it was just teleporting to various classrooms or little rooms. So it definitely didn't feel like there was much to be explored in a lot of these towns. While there was some, the occasional hidden item or hidden TM around the corner, like there wasn't a whole lot of reason to go around and immerse yourself in the city. Even games like Skyrim 11 years ago managed to make each city worth exploring and make it worth talking to each individual person or walking into each building and seeing what there was. And even some Pokemon games of the past have been able to do it, but this game just, all the cities felt bland, and some of them didn't even feel like cities. There was like 3 buildings, and you were like, oh yeah, that's supposed to be a city, but it was 3 random buildings. The main city on the coast that has the electric gym leader was a kind of cool, I guess, but again, felt super lifeless, super bland, and you couldn't even go into buildings. And to tie in with that, obviously, the shops that you're supposed to spend a lot of time in to get materials to build sandwiches and stuff like that, they don't even have rendered insides. You just essentially load into the door and it pops up a menu. So it's just a menu UI and that's it. And again, like the world just didn't feel cohesive or like an actual region or country at all. And I know this is their first attempt at like an open world, and you can't really say that any of the games of the past have felt like a real world, but they're mostly just barren landscapes and wilderness. And then you'll see like a random town pop up in the middle of, that, and that be about it. It seemed like they were more going, it almost felt more like a safari zone in a world, tons of natural landscapes that you can see Pokemon spawning in, and then occasional little settlements, and that's about it. Hopefully the future installments have a little bit more of a realistic touch to be a little more immersive to the player, but this first iteration was just not great in that regard. And next thing, and I know this is a tiny, stupid, nitpicking thing, but you can't change out of your uniform. So you're a student and you kind of go on a summer break of sorts to figure yourself out. That's kind of the overarching plot. And as such, you're just constantly in your school uniform. And it really limits customization. And especially, they go so far as to try to give you a lot of great customization, like backpacks, helmets, hats, gloves, stuff like that. But it all really clashes with the dumb uniform that you're stuck wearing. Like right now, for example, I'm wearing like a super cool, it's like golden, like a Daft Punk type helmet. It literally looks like one of the helmets from Daft Punk. And I'm wearing like super cool like yellow athletic training shoes and yellow gloves and a super cool sporty yellow black or backpack. And then I'm just wearing like purple slacks with suspenders and a long sleeve button up that I can't change. You can change like four different outfits for the different seasons, but honestly, this one looks the best. The other ones look far, far worse. So it's like it clashes so heavily. You almost have to have purple gear or orange or red gear if you're playing Scarlet, and it makes no sense really. I don't know why they instituted that, but maybe in the future you can go back to wearing new shirts and pants. There's also a lot of cringy dialogue in this. Now, I know I praised the story for being a little more mature and adult up before, but that doesn't mean that it's completely devoid of super cringy dialogue. Clive, which won't do any spoilers, but just a character you meet called Clive throughout the story has some incredibly cringy dialogue, and especially when you know who they actually are, it just makes it like I know some of it's purposeful, like they try to be cringy just to get a laugh, and I can respect that, but some of it is still just super bad writing and made me roll my eyes super hard. I know I'm 26 years old, going on 27. I've kind of aged out of the demographic they're trying to appeal to, but it still was just really bad sometimes. And also, this is kind of spoiler territory, but not really. Penny, who you meet along the story, eventually you go on a journey with her and Arvin and your rival Nimona, and she's just like a super passive aggressive and super mean to him for no reason. Like they're all like kind of super hypocritical to each other. I won't do a deep dive on the story by any means. That could be another video entirely. But like, there was just some moments where I was like, who would ever talk like this? Like they were just needlessly mean or like throwing low shots at each other for no reason. And it wasn't like for humor or to advance the plot line or to show character traits or anything. It was just like super mean and whiny for no reason, and it kind of made some of the characters that I did like before just super unlikable. And hopefully, that was just it was just a weird kind of unexpected turn of events in terms of how they talk to one another and stuff like that. One of the biggest criticisms I have of this game is the game touted itself as a very do what you want in whatever order you want. And it is very much so not that way. There's a very set route that you should take on everything. The levels do not scale. They could have easily avoided this by having levels that scaled, right? So that when you took on your first gym, no matter which gym it was, they were between 15 and 18. And, the sixth gym, no matter what gym you went to, that was your sixth badge, they were this level. That would have made it truly open world, and you can go to whatever gym you want, whatever order you want. But that's not the case here. They're still ordered and leveled like a typical Pokemon game. So you do technically have the freedom to do whatever you want. You can go anywhere and take on any gym leader you want, or if you want to knock out all the Titans at once and then go back and do all the gym leaders at once. But you're going to be massively overleveled. So I ended up just pulling up a chart from a game guides type website that just had like, okay, this Titan is at level 16, this gym is around level 17, okay, this, Team Starbase is level 21, and I just went down in order of that. That way I was never over leveled for anything, and I didn't have to grind excessively. I know, like, my girlfriend was doing it, and she thought that one of the gyms, because of its proximity to another gym, would have been the next in the line. And in fact, it wasn't. It was like 4 or 5 up the list. So she grinded for hours to try to get Pokemon up 20, 30 levels from what they were just to take on this gym, only to then have to go back and knock out like 3 or 4 other gyms that she just wiped the floor with because she was over leveled, right? And so honestly, if you don't do it in the exact level, in the exact, kind of path that they are set up in terms of levels, it just leads to horrible inconsistencies. So, despite them saying that you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, it's not the case. You still have to kind of do it in order if you want a reasonably decent experience, unfortunately. Next up, the shinies do not sparkle or make noise or stand out at all in the overworld. And for a game that is, much easier, like we talked about before, of getting shinies, it just makes it hell on earth sometimes to be able to find the actual shinies. So between the horrible render distance and pop-in and some of the shading issues affecting coloring, past like 10 or 20 yards, it just makes it super hard to see shinies. And especially bad for Pokemon whose shiny distances you either don't know, and you don't know which color is which, or can't easily distinguish. And there's several Pokemon in the game that just, in general, have different color schemes. Like the I think it's called Squawkabilly, is like the little bird. He has like 4 different colors he can be. Tatsugiri is like the little sushi dragon Pokemon. He can have like 3 or 4 different colors he could be. So not only are you looking for shinies, you're also seeing different colors of Pokemon. They're just normal, right? They're not even shiny. So you can't just say, oh, that one's green. I've been seeing a bunch of blue ones. That must be shiny. And like I said, especially for ones that don't have a difference, like Garchomp, literally looks identical to his normal form and everything. So some of them are very hard to distinguish. And some of them, you have to physically look up the color differences. Like I had to pull up in a guide for some of them just to see. And God knows how many I've skipped just because I can't see them. Maybe their character model's too small, like Flabebe and that family. Or just because I truly didn't know what the shiny looked like, so I just ignored it. In Legends of Arceus, in the overworld, they were shiny. There was like a hum associated when you got near them. They were super, like you knew when there was a shiny. Even if you didn't know beforehand what that shiny version of that specific species looked like, you knew instantly. In this case, not the case at all. And to make matters worse, the lighting during certain times of the day just casts a different, like, hue or color onto all the Pokemon, and so you find yourself being like, oh, that looks like a completely different color, but no, it's just the evening sunlight. And while that is realistic, and I love that they added that updated lighting engine, it still doesn't help the fact that it makes shiny hunting nigh impossible at some points, and a chore even at the best of times. And finally, as just a little nitpick on the same subject as well, they don't appear as shiny in the box sprites. So you have to physically load the Pokemon model, which takes forever. Don't get me started on that. But you either have to check the summary or wait for the Pokemon model to load in, or check for the little tiny shiny icon on the Pokemon's like general summary when you hover over it. To be able to know if it's shiny or not, because their box sprites are all the same. So I have, for example, I had two Rufflets that would eventually, one was shiny, one was not. I had to keep hovering over which one was which because their box art was the same. And that's just a kind of tiny little inconsistency that I didn't like, but I felt that it had to be noted. Next up, trade-only evolutions and version exclusives are back, and that's kind of annoying. There's a huge quality of life improvement in Arceus, Legends of Arceus, that the Pokedex could be 100%ed without a single trade or other game cartridge, in that even Pokemon that had trade evolutions, you just used an item called a link cable that you would buy in-game on the Pokemon, and it would evolve them as if they'd just been traded. Unfortunately, now I have to find someone to trade again, just like the olden days, just to be able to get my 100% regional dex. And trade evolutions are the worst offender because, again, in the past you could just use that item, use a metal coat on Scyther or use a link cable on Haunter to get a Gengar, stuff like that. And it just flowed easier, and it made it feel like you could truly accomplish everything without needing a friend or without needing to reach out to someone. And for some people that maybe don't have a whole lot of friends or a little bit socially awkward, that could be pretty insurmountable for them. Now, luckily, again, I have my girlfriend in the other room that happens to have the other cartridge, so things were a lot easier, but I know hundreds, if not thousands of people will not have it that easy. And another one to bring up is just like Palafin evolves by using the Union Circle, which I've yet to do. That's like one of the last Pokemon I have to complete the dex. It just seems like an overly convoluted and possibly stupid way of evolving Pokemon. Just cut out the need for other people entirely, please. Please, I beg of you. And trading just feels forced. Like they have to meet a quota of making sure that people interact with other people because Nintendo kind of has this weird, like, oh, gaming finds you friends mindset. And, it's just kind of rough. Now, for Paradox Pokemon, I kind of do understand. I do like that those are separate and you can't get one on the other game. But for the rest of them, I just wish they would do away with trade evolutions entirely. And next up, the crafting system honestly just feels half-baked. I mean, the TMs are good, but these systems are usually made for endgame grinding of gear or, gear crafting. And they're kind of implemented in this game as a way to catch up with the most recent, like, looter shooters and stuff like that and MMOs. But TMs aren't really the place for that, right? I mean, Pokemon typically learn pretty good moves, and even if they don't, like the system of buying them before was just fine. I think I've crafted 2 TMs in over 80 plus hours of gameplay. So honestly, I just, it's not worth it. And this makes it much less appealing to grind certain materials since there isn't much of a point, right? There's no point for me to go out and kill 100, or sorry, faint 100 of, say, spoinks to get spoink pearls to then craft something reasonable because all I do is just craft a TM that I probably don't need or that I probably have already picked up in the overworld already. And the one minor exception to this is that you do need a certain shards of a certain Pokemon to make Charcadet's armor. There's certain armor in Scarlet and a different armor in Violet. Like for me, I had to battle a bunch of Sinisties to get Sinisty chips or something like that to then make the malicious armor to get Ceruledge. And that was really cool, and I really wish that they would have expanded past that just to make grinding and material farming just somewhat viable or useful in this game. Next up, and I'm not going to touch too much on it, but no, there is no national dex. So as of this point, I don't believe you can transfer any Pokemon to the game. I know they said Pokemon Home support's coming later, so I assume at some point the national dex will come, but people were super mad when Sword and Shield didn't have it. They're going to be mad this year again. There is no national dex. Again, there's a great regional dex, but for right now, there is no national dex in the game, so you can't get all 1,000 and some Pokemon just yet. And next up, we finally have to talk about, I've avoided for going on an hour of this review, but we have to talk about the just overall performance of the game. And it is not good. Not by a long shot. I'm sure you've heard all about it on reviews, on Reddit, on Twitter. I mean, the entire internet has lost their minds about it. But to start off, this has a horrific frame rate. At best, it touches 30 sometimes. And, you can argue whether that's the Switch's fault or the developer's fault, but either way, it just has a horrific frame rate. And one of the worst offenders is in the very first, couple of hours of gameplay, there's a classroom cutscene where you're kind of in a classroom with a bunch of classmates, and they're all, wiggling their feet under the desk, except for they're moving at literally, 5 frames per second. They are 2 feet away from you in this room in a quote-unquote pre-rendered cutscene or whatever, and they're still going at 5 frames a second. It's embarrassing. You see the same thing of anything that's farther than a few feet away from you just gets hacked and slashed to nothing. The character models are terrible. The animations are terrible. The animation frame rates are terrible. Unless it is right in front of you, it looks god awful. Sometimes even whenever you start battle with a Pokemon, they honestly look like that old game Pokemon Rumble Rush, where they were all angly and kind of stupid looking. Because they were balloon Pokemon. They kind of look like that until the game, they do their opening cry, and then the game fully renders them to have their full level of detail. And because of this horrific frame rate, weather effects or areas where there's a lot of foliage, and I use the term lot of foliage very loosely because it is a lot of foliage for a 2003 game, not a 2023 game. But it just slows everything to a crawl, right? The FPS tank to well under 20, probably under 10 at some points. And because of the way the game is processed, the lower frame rate means the game physically runs slow. I mean, the character's movement speed is hampered. A lot of other things are slow. It just bogs it down insufferably so. And the pop-in is extremely laughable. I mean, every game kind of has pop-in. I was even playing the Skyrim Special Edition earlier today, that they've, had years and years to fix, and it still has occasional pop-in textures and whatever. But the pop-in in this game is laughable. I mean, it especially sucks when you're spawning in Pokemon and when shiny hunting, because stuff just doesn't load. Like even like past like 10 or 15 meters from you, it just doesn't load. So, if you're trying to farm Pokemon or see if you see a shiny on the horizon or, spawn new Pokemon to battle, it's so poorly optimized and everything pops in. The ground itself morphs and like right in front of your very eyes, like morphs. It literally looks like a early sci-fi's like a computer generated effect of it like morphing into its actual shape as you get up close to it. It's horrible. And even when the stuff is loaded in, it's just not very pretty. And again, like I don't expect the world from a Pokemon game, but it is not very beautiful. The character models are great. They've done a great job. They've handcrafted. They've spent a lot of time on them. But pretty much everything else looks like it was made for an early 2000s game. And I mean that is as nicely as I can put it, but it looks very early 2000s. There's also numerous graphical glitches, mostly during co-op, I think people have said. So I haven't personally experienced because I haven't played co-op myself, but people's heads spinning around and their arms doing weird stuff, and when they get on the bike Pokemon, they like grow 300 times their normal size, and just a bunch of weird stuff like that. You can find it all over YouTube. I'm not going to go into detail. There's also hard crashes. Now, me personally, I have hard crashed 4 times and been soft locked at a cutscene twice. So that's a total of 6 crashes in 80 hours. So nothing like totally egregious, but definitely more than I would have liked to seen. But honestly, less than I expected for how horribly the game runs in general. A game running like this, I would expect it to crash every 10 minutes, but it doesn't. And one of the biggest keys is you have to close out the game because of a suspected memory leak. So honestly, if you want the game to run a little bit better, I advise docking up your Switch and closing out of the game every time you're done playing it. So don't leave it open for days and weeks on end, and just go back into your Switch. And that should help with the performance a decent amount. It's helped me out a lot. Still not great by any means, but better than it was. And finally, not finally, but one of the last things I have here is there's super long battle animations, and I think that's tied into the performance of the game overall, but there's like weird time spent between actions, and all the actions play out and take forever. So for example, like Cloth has an ability, the brand new crab Pokemon Cloth has an ability where I think once he gets below a certain health, like all 5 of his stats change or something like that. And instead of just saying like his stats changed and it's a 5-second little thing and you're done, it plays a 5 to 10 second animation and tells you what stat was raised 5 different times. So if you wanted to grind Cloths and like at whatever EVs that Cloths give, if you wanted to grind them or grind them to get their little materials without quick battling, you have to just sit there and endure those stat changes every single time, which is super rough. And in addition to this, stuff like weather effects or status effects constantly playing, it just adds several minutes onto some battles. Honestly, like several minutes onto some of the battles. By now, it still plays the, Pikachu is confused. And then it waits 30 seconds. Pikachu hurt itself in its confusion. You could tell that it's just trying to load stuff in the background. So it's trying desperately just to put something on your screen so you think that something is happening, when in reality, it's just been trying to load for the last, 2 or 3 minutes. And finally, guys, the last really big nitpick that I have, or con of the game, is the world just feels lifeless and dull overall. And I talked about this up above, but just wanted to give an overall sentiment that while I am glad the Pokemon is in the open world genre finally, and hopefully this is a great leaping off point, as of right now, this open world is not good. If you're looking for a fun, exciting open world to get lost in, this one couldn't be farther from that. It does have every biome. It checks a lot of boxes. It has some cool vistas here and there. Don't get me wrong. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but overall the world just feels incredibly lifeless and incredibly dull. So that about rounds it up for all of the negatives of the game. I know that it took a little longer than expected, but so now I just want to break down what is my overall verdict for the game. So we have a couple categories here, and if you've watched some of my previous previous reviews, you'll recognize these, but basically I just want to give it an arbitrary score. Hey guys, Future Crunchy Frog here. As I'm editing the video, I realized that I skipped over just a couple little things I wanted to mention before we get to the rating part of the video, so I'm going to slice in here just to add. For one, I wanted to talk about the new gimmick this generation, which is terrestrialization. Basically, your Pokemon just comes encrusted with diamonds or ores of some sort, and essentially becomes a single type, whatever its Terra type is, and it gains significant power to that specific type. So obviously rearranging what your Pokemon's typing is super cool, giving it a bunch of power if it happens to terrestrialize into one of its already stab types, one of the types it already is, gives it a lot more power, but you can also kind of combine different typings and stuff like that, and it's really cool as a mechanic. However, I just hate how they look. I think the crowns are super dumb looking, to be honest. I much prefer to Mega Evolutions and even Gigantamax and Dynamax from the previous versions. So overall, the look and feel of the mechanic is kind of bleh, but the effects are really cool. I really enjoy being able to terrestrialize a Pokemon and getting a ton more power out of specific moves. Next up is just the quick battling system. I touched on it once or twice, but essentially you can send your Pokemon out to just quick battle Pokemon in the overworld without entering a battle screen. They get, I think, a fifth or a quarter of the experience they normally would get, and they do not get any effort values, but they do get the Pokemon resources that the Pokemon drop in order to craft TMs. Overall, I think it's a super cool feature. Obviously, I don't use it too often because the XP yields are fairly low and you don't get effort values from battling, but I still used it a whole lot to get some passive XP, and it's especially useful in the mass outbreaks in order to clear Pokemon to up your shiny chance. Again, that would be a whole nother video to explain, but essentially it is super useful when trying to find shiny Pokemon or just making more Pokemon spawn in general. And finally, I just wanted to add about the new sandwich crafting mechanic, essentially ways to earn buffs throughout the game. I think it's a great mechanic. I haven't delved too far into it, but I know it's a critical part of shiny hunting, and especially raid powers. I've used it a couple times in order to hatch and make eggs faster for Pokemon breeding. So there's a wide variety of benefits. I think the overall UI for it is kind of clunky, having to put all the condiments together and stuff, but overall I think the benefits they give you is really cool. So without further ado, back to the video. Compare them to other games as they come out. So I'll put them all up on screen now. Obviously the visuals, a 3 out of 10. It is not a pretty game, but I did have to give it some credit for the Pokemon models because they are really good, and I love the new shaders. Gameplay, again, 9 out of 10. I had an incredible amount of fun with this game. It is incredibly addicting. It is the Pokemon formula, but just better in almost every way. So again, a 9 out of 10 for gameplay alone. The progression / accomplishment factor from the game, for someone who almost needs to feel a sense of accomplishment from playing a game or feel a steady progression curve, this gets a 9 out of 10. Obviously, it's Pokemon, right? You're getting badges. Your Pokemon are constantly leveling up. You're constantly getting new moves and evolving monsters and stuff like that. Like the Pokemon games themselves are they're always going to get a high score in this regard because that's just how they're set up. They're set up to constantly be giving you levels and accomplishment, and you beat the gym leaders and you become champion and all that stuff. So 9 out of 10 in that regard. Monetary value, it wasn't worth the $60 that you paid to buy it. I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. Again, the kind of state that it is in at launch in terms of performance and frame rate and stuff like that is not good, and that kind of does hurt since it is supposed to be a AAA game. Again, it's one of the biggest franchises of all time, so I did have to dock some points for that. But overall, I mean, I'm 80 hours in and cruising. I could see me easily hitting 100, maybe even 150, 200 hours at some point in this game without much issue, and paying $60 to have 200 hours of fun, well worth it in my opinion. So again, I did have to dox it a little bit for the state and polish of the game, but overall, super good monetary value. And finally, the story, I had to give 7 out of 10. Obviously, still cringy, still a lot of plot holes, not great exposition or anything. It's Pokemon. There's no voice acting, which hurts as well. I didn't mention that up above, but that was something that I was not happy about. I feel like now with all the cutscenes and dialogue and stuff, there should be voice acting. There's still not. But, so it did have to take some points off. But overall, this is one of the best Pokemon stories. So if you compare it to past Pokemon games, this is like a 12 out of 10 compared to some past Pokemon games. So that alone gave this a 7 out of 10. So, in conclusion, I really enjoyed my time in Paldea. Despite its many shortcomings, this game already ranks as one of my favorite Pokemon games of all time. It innovates the Pokemon formula in such a way to keep it feeling fresh without losing the core identity of the franchise. The open world elements are largely underbaked and could honestly use a lot of fine tuning before the next mainline game in the series, but the potential is definitely there. I know the internet has been having an absolute field day ridiculing and hating on this game, but I gotta be honest with you, I don't agree with all of the critics. I recognize the game is unfinished and unoptimized. Obviously, the con list above was kind of massive, but there's absolutely, like zero excuses for the game to come out in such a state. But let me tell you what, it's just so incredibly fun. And I know that Pokemon is one of the highest selling entertainment brands of all time. And maybe perhaps it is time for Game Freak to expand and grow their studio. I think they only have 160 people as of right now. So maybe they need to expand and grow to a proper AAA developer size, especially if they're going to be, handling the largest franchise of all time. But I'm not giving up on them just yet. At the end of the day, the game has still brought plenty of smiles to my face and has kept me enraptured for, again, close to 100 hours and counting of gameplay. Hopefully, with a few more DLC launches and post-launch content drops, this game could go down as one of the best and certainly one of my favorites for the franchise. So now, what you've all been waiting for. Should I buy the game? And in my opinion, yes, absolutely. If graphics and smooth 60 frames per second gameplay are literally all you look for in a game, perhaps, yeah, you should sit this one out. But if you're like me and you just love Pokemon games, this game is going to bring you dozens of hours of fun and excitement. It is a fantastic game. You're buying Pokemon games to play a Pokemon game. This is definitely a great one to have on your shelf. Opting not to buy the game to, quote, stick it to Nintendo for the game's launch date kind of makes logical sense, and I agree with voting with your wallet type of stuff, but honestly, you'll be robbing yourself of a good time. Overall, I would highly recommend it. So that about wraps it up. Remember to leave a like if you've enjoyed this review and if you've stuck with us this long, as it greatly helps the video and our channel succeed. And ultimately, what did you think of the game? Did it live up to your expectations? Were you able to look past the numerous bugs and performance issues to still have fun? Let me know in the comments section below. So, guys, this has been Crunchy Frog with another in-depth review, and I hope you all have a great day.